Long before machines, before metal tools, before cities, and before written memory, human beings were already facing stone on a scale that still feels difficult to hold in the mind. At Göbekli Tepe, limestone pillars were cut, shaped, moved, and raised by people living near the beginning of settled life. Some of the standing pillars weighed many tons, and one unfinished stone left in the quarry has been estimated at around 50 tons. Then, after generations of effort, the place was covered beneath the earth. Was this memory, ritual, protection, abandonment, or something history has not yet taught us to recognize? 12,000 years ago, who raised 5 zero-ton stones, and why was the temple buried beneath the earth? Before the first streets were laid down, before walls began to divide inside from outside, before names were pressed into clay or remembered by kings, human life moved in a much quieter kind of history. It was a history of footsteps, fires, animal tracks, seeds, storms, and the changing weight of seasons. A person living near the end of the last ice age did not wake inside a world of monument. They woke inside a world that had to be read with the body. The cold in the morning, the dryness of the grass, the distance to water, the movement of birds, the sound of animals beyond the hill, all of these were signs that mattered. Survival was not an idea. It was the slow work of paying attention. This is why Göbekli Tepe feels so difficult to place in the ordinary story we tell about ourselves. We often imagine that large stone monuments belong to a later human world, a world with crowded towns, stored grain, rulers, builders, and people whose hands were freed from the constant search for food. Yet on a limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, there are remains of a much older kind of effort. The people connected to this place lived close to the beginning of settled life, in a time when hunting, gathering, seasonal movement, and new forms of staying near one place overlapped in ways that archaeologists still study carefully. They were not modern engineers in ancient costumes. They were human beings with bone, muscle, breath, hunger, fear, memory, and a deep need to make sense of the land around them. The question begins there, not with fantasy, but with the contrast between the softness of the human body and the hardness of stone. A single person could not simply lift such pillars and place them upright by will. Even the idea of cutting stone from bedrock, shaping it, moving it across uneven ground, and raising it into a planned space, asks us to slow down. It asks us to imagine time measured not only by days, but by repeated hands on the same surface, by bodies returning again and again to a task that outlasted fatigue. At Göbekli Tepe, the stones were not scattered by accident in the way fallen rocks gather beneath a cliff. They were shaped, they were arranged. Some stood in circular or oval spaces. Some carried carvings of animals, signs, and forms that suggest a world of attention far deeper than simple shelter. Yet it is just as important to say what we do not know. We do not know the full meaning of the place. We do not know the names of the people who worked there. We do not know exactly what they believed, or how they explained the stones to one another, or what memories were carried from one generation to the next. The silence is not empty. It is a boundary. It reminds us that the beginning of human history was not written for us. It was left in bones, tools, soil, and stone. When we stand in thought before this buried place, we are not only looking at an ancient structure, we are looking at an early question about what humans became when they began to gather around something larger than immediate need. Food still mattered. Weather still mattered. The body still tired. Children still had to be protected. The night still came with cold and uncertainty. But somewhere in that difficult world, people gave labour to stone, and that labour remained long after their voices disappeared. This is where the mystery should begin, gently and carefully. Not with the claim that everything is explained, but with the sight of early humans standing between survival and meaning, between the living body and the lasting earth. To understand why this place feels so strange in the human story, it helps to imagine what was not yet there. There were no cities in the ordinary sense, with streets full of strangers and buildings stacked in long rows. There were no palaces, no written records, no metal blades, no wheels carrying stone across prepared roads. The people of that deep time lived in a world where the earth itself decided much of the rhythm. The return of rain, the movement of herds, the ripening of wild plants, the danger of cold nights, the distance between one camp and another, These were not background details. They shaped the limits of the day. Every human body had to answer to them. Feet had to cross rough ground. Hands had to gather, cut, scrape, carry, and repair. Eyes had to notice small changes before hunger became serious. This is why the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe do not feel like a simple beginning of architecture. They feel like a question placed directly inside the oldest habits of survival. If life was so tied to food, weather, movement, and danger, why gather labor around stone? Why shape pillars when a shelter could be made more simply? Why carve animals into limestone when the living animals themselves still move through the surrounding land? The answer is not something we can take from the stones as if they were speaking in a language we fully know, but the question itself is powerful because it touches the beginning of what made humans different. Other animals build nests, dens, paths, and shelters. Humans also did those things. Yet somewhere in our past, human groups began to build spaces that were not only useful in the immediate sense, they made places that held attention. They returned to them. They marked them. They may have gathered around them in ways that connected memory, danger, food, death, animals, seasons, and belonging. At Göbekli Tepe, this possibility appears very early, before the long familiar image of settled village life had fully taken shape. That does not mean the builders were primitive in mind. It means they belonged to a world where technical simplicity and deep social complexity could exist together. A stone tool may look plain beside a modern machine, but it can still carry generations of knowledge. A limestone pillar may seem silent, but the decision to cut it from bedrock and raise it upright points to planning, cooperation, and repeated effort. Each of those things begins with the body. One person must see where the stone lies. Another must know how it breaks. Others must bring food, water, time, and patience. The work would have been slow, and because it was slow, it would have changed the people doing it. A task that lasts beyond one afternoon becomes more than force. It becomes coordination. It becomes memory in the muscles. It becomes a shared rhythm that has to be held by many people at once. Near the beginning of settled human life, this matters deeply. The oldest roots of civilization may not be only in fields or houses. They may also be in the act of gathering around a difficult task that no single body could complete alone. Göbekli Tepe asks us to look at early humans without shrinking them into a simple picture of hunger and instinct. Hunger was real. Instinct was real. Cold, thirst, injury, and fear were real. But so was the human capacity to make a place matter. So was the strange ability to spend energy on something that did not immediately feed the mouth or warm the skin. The stones remind us that the beginning of human history was not a clean line between wildlife and civilized life. It was a long, uneven threshold, where people still lived close to animals and weather but were already shaping the earth into places of memory. The more carefully we look at this early stone place, the less it behaves like a simple monument from a simple age. It stands near a threshold in human life, not on one clear side of it. Behind it is the long world of mobile foragers, people who followed animals, watched plants, remembered water, and carried knowledge through movement. Ahead of it is the slower world of villages, fields, storage, heavier houses, and more permanent ties to particular ground. Göbekli Tepe seems to rest between these worlds, like a ridge between two valleys. That is why it should not be treated as a sudden miracle, or as proof of a lost empire no one can name. The more honest wonder is quieter. It is the wonder of people who are still close to the old human beginning, yet already capable of changing a hill into a place that held repeated attention. Their world was not empty before stone was raised. It was full of tracks, plants, animals, tools, fires, shelters, stories, and older memories we cannot hear. But stone does something different from a campfire or a path. A fire dies down. A path can fade under grass. A skin shelter can be taken apart and carried away. Stone remains. When human beings began to place meaning into stone, they were touching time in a new way. They were making something that could stay still while bodies aged, while children grew, while seasons returned, and while the people who first touched the surface disappeared. This is one of the deep tensions at the center of the title. A human body is temporary, but the limestone is patient. A hand can tire in minutes, but a pillar can wait for thousands of years. We should not imagine that the people who shaped these stones thought about time exactly as we do. That would be too much to claim. But the archaeological remains allow a more careful thought. Whatever the purpose was, the work required an investment beyond the moment. It required people to return, to remember, to organize, and to treat the place as more than ordinary ground. The question of who raised the stones is therefore not only a question about muscle, it is also a question about a group. No single body explains Göbekli Tepe. The old human body, with its limits of breadth and strength, becomes important precisely because it could not do this alone. The stones point toward cooperation, shared timing, and some kind of social agreement, even if the exact form of that agreement is gone. This takes us back to the earliest human condition. Our ancestors did not survive mainly because each person was stronger than the world around them. They survived because bodies could gather, share attention, divide labor, remember places, and act together. A stone pillar makes that truth visible in a way bone tools and hearths sometimes do not. It is not only an object, it is the trace of many small lives meeting one large task. And then there is the second silence. The place was later covered. Here again the careful mind must move slowly. It is tempting to turn burial into a dramatic secret, as if someone hid a forbidden truth beneath the soil, but archaeology asks for patience. A site can be filled, renewed, abandoned, covered, reused, or transformed through many acts over time. Earth can preserve what memory no longer explains. Still, even with caution, the image remains powerful. People gave labor to stone, and later the stones lay under the hill, waiting through ages when writing, farming, kingdoms, roads, and modern machines would all appear. The beginning of the human story is not only behind us. Sometimes it is under us, silent, heavy, and unfinished. To understand the hill where the stones were found, it helps to move away from the image of an isolated ruin. Göbekli Tepe was not floating outside the human world. It stood within a living landscape, on a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, where wide views open toward plains, valleys, and distant movement. The ground itself mattered. Limestone was near enough to be cut. Wild animals moved through the region. Seasonal plants grew and faded. Water, shelter, food, and visibility shaped where people could gather and how long they could remain. In deep history, a place is never only a place. It is a set of possibilities and limits. For people living near the beginning of settled life, the land around them was not scenery. It was memory, map, danger, storehouse, and boundary all at once. A hill could mean safety because it could be seen from far away. A valley could mean food because animals passed through it. A stone outcrop could mean tools, building material, or a mark that helped people return. This is why the location of Göbekli Tepe is part of the mystery, not just the background to it. The builders were not choosing stone in an empty world. They were working inside a region where the earth gave them both the material and the problem. The same ridge that offered limestone also demanded effort. The same high ground that made the place visible also made every movement of heavy stone more difficult. Human beings at that time still lived close to older rhythms of survival. Their bodies were trained by walking, carrying, watching, waiting, and reacting to small changes in the environment. A change in weather could alter the day. A failed gathering season could matter. The absence of animals could change the path of a group. This closeness to the land is important because it keeps the stones from becoming an abstract puzzle. They were not raised by a faceless, ancient people in a blank desert of imagination. They were raised by humans whose lives were tied to specific slopes, soils, animals, plants, and seasonal returns. The ridge held more than stone. It held a point of connection between movement and return. Mobile groups may have known certain places again and again, not because they lived there in the later village sense, but because memory can attach itself to repeated routes. A spring, a hunting ground, a stand of trees, a hill with pale stone, these could become anchors in a world that still required movement. Göbekli Tepe may belong to that kind of threshold, where old routes and new forms of gathering began to overlap. This does not mean every detail is known. It means the question should be placed carefully inside the landscape. When we ask who raised the stones, we are also asking what kind of land made such work imaginable. The answer cannot be only the hands. It must include the ridge, the stone bed, the animals, the plants, the paths, the seasons, and the people who learned them over time. Near the start of the long human shift toward more settled life, places like this remind us that settlement did not begin only with walls and houses. It may have begun more softly, with repeated return, shared attention, and a growing weight of memory placed on certain ground. Before a village becomes permanent, a place can already become important. Before a field is planted, a hill can already draw people back. Before written history begins, the land can already hold a kind of record. Göbekli Tepe rests inside that quiet possibility. The stones rose from the same earth that surrounded the people who shaped them, and later, that same earth covered them again. The land around Göbekli Tepe belonged to one of the most important turning zones in the human past. It was not yet the world of large cities, but it was no longer simply the endless Ice Age landscape that had shaped human life for so long. The climate was changing. Plants and animals were responding. Human groups were also responding, not all at once, and not in one simple direction, but through many small adjustments across generations. In this kind of world, a hill could become more than a hill. It could become a place where roots crossed, where people returned in certain seasons, where memory settled because the land itself helped people remember. The ridge was high enough to see across the surrounding country. The limestone lay close enough to be worked. The open views may have made the place visible from a distance. The surrounding environment offered animals, wild plants, and paths through which people, herds, and knowledge could move. None of this proves a single purpose. But it helps us understand why such a place could gather meaning before written history existed. Early humans did not read maps on skins or tablets in the way later people would. They carried maps inside the body. A path was known by the feet. A water source was known by thirst and return. A slope was known by the strain it placed on the legs. A stone outcrop was known by the sound it made under a tool, by the way it fractured, by the effort it demanded. This kind of knowledge was quiet, physical, and repeated. It belonged to the older beginning of human life, when survival depended on remembering the land through movement. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe did not rise from nowhere. It rose from a long human habit of paying attention to places. What makes it unusual is the way that attention became fixed into stone. A camp can move, a hunting route can shift, a gathering place can fade when the season changes, but a carved pillar changes the relationship between people and ground. It says without words that a place has been marked with effort. It draws the human body back to a point that does not move. This may be one of the quietest revolutions in the story of our species. Before people fully lived in the permanent worlds of later villages and cities, they may already have had places that pulled memory towards stillness. The stones at Göbekli Tepe ask us to imagine that transition carefully, not as a sudden leap from wildness to civilization, but as a slow thickening of human attention. A group that returns to the same ridge again and again begins to see it differently. A stone bed that was once only material becomes a possible shape. A hill that was once only a viewpoint becomes a center. A place that was once one point among many begins to hold more stories, more labor, more distance between ordinary movement and special return. This matters because the title is not only about weight, it is about why weight was accepted at all. If a stone is heavy, the simplest choice is to leave it where it lies. If a task drains energy, the simplest choice is to spend that energy on food, shelter, or rest. Yet the remains at Göbekli Tepe suggest that people gave repeated effort to stone in a world where effort was never cheap. The landscape helps explain how this could happen without making the mystery disappear. It offered limestone, visibility, and perhaps a meeting point within a wider pattern of movement. But it did not lift the stones by itself. Human bodies still had to enter the work. Human memory still had to hold the place. Human groups still had to return. Beneath the quiet ridge, the beginning of the story is not a hidden city or a vanished empire. It is something older and more human, a landscape slowly becoming a place that people could not treat as ordinary ground. The ridge of Göbekli Tepe becomes easier to feel when we think of it not as a finished ruin, but as a place that gathered layers of human return. Long before anyone wrote down a boundary, a name, or a date, certain places could already become fixed in memory, because the land itself made them hard to forget. A high point above the surrounding country does not only offer a view, it changes how the body experiences space. A person climbing toward it feels the slope in the calves and breath. A person standing there sees distance open outward. A person returning after many days, or many seasons, may recognize the shape of the hill before recognizing anything built upon it. This kind of recognition belongs to the oldest human relationship with landscape. It is not abstract. It is carried through walking, hunger, direction, weather, and repeated arrival. For early groups living near the slow beginning of settled life, such a place could become important before it became permanent. The ground could first be a marker, then a meeting place, then a memory, and only later something shaped by stone. In that order, the mystery becomes quieter, but deeper. The stones did not create meaning from nothing. They may have fixed meaning that was already gathering around the ridge. This is one reason the discovery matters so much to the story of human origins. We often imagine that people first settled down, then built important places, then created shared memory around them. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that the order may not always have been so simple. A place can draw people before it houses them. A task can gather bodies before a town exists. A ridge can become special before there are walls, fields, or written names. The beginning of human history may have been less like a straight road and more like a slow tightening of attention around certain points in the land. Here, limestone was close. The material was not brought from some distant mountain in a way that would demand impossible stories. It belonged to the hill and its surroundings. Yet nearness does not make the labour easy. Stone close at hand is still stone. It must be separated, shaped, moved, lifted, and placed. The land gave the possibility, but the human body paid the cost. This is where environment and effort meet. A hill can offer stone, but it cannot organise hands. A quarry can offer a pillar shape, but it cannot decide that a place should be marked. A view can make a ridge visible, but it cannot explain why people returned with enough purpose to leave a structure under the soil for thousands of years. The people who worked there lived in a world where survival still required practical attention. They knew animals not as symbols first, but as living presences in the same landscape. They knew plants not as background, but as food, medicine, fuel, fibre, and season. They knew stone not as decoration, but as tool edge, shelter, weight, and danger. When such people shaped pillars and placed them in planned spaces, the act did not float above ordinary life. It rose out of ordinary life, carrying the weight of it. This makes the site more human, not less. It brings the mystery closer to the body. Imagine the long patience required to return to the same ground when nothing in nature demanded a monument there. Imagine the slow agreement needed for many people to treat one ridge differently from others. Imagine generations passing through a landscape where some places were only crossed, while one place was remembered, worked, and eventually covered. We do not need to invent a vanished kingdom to feel the depth of that change. The more grounded possibility is already powerful enough. Near the start of a new human way of living, a landscape became a centre of repeated effort. A hill of limestone became a place where the human body, still close to hunger and weather, began to leave memory in the earth. When the buried spaces of Göbekli Tepe are imagined slowly, they do not first appear as houses. They do not resemble ordinary shelters built only to keep out wind, rain, or night cold. The most striking remains are the great T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing in planned circles or oval arrangements, with smaller stones and walls around them. Their shape is simple at first glance, almost quiet. A tall, upright body of stone rises from the ground, and a broad stone head crosses it at the top. Yet that simplicity makes them more unsettling, because they seem neither fully like tools nor fully like walls. They stand as if they are marking a space that meant something beyond daily protection. Archaeologists have found carved animals and signs on some of these stones, including creatures that belong to the surrounding world of early humans: foxes, snakes, birds, wild boar, and other forms that must be interpreted with care. We should not pretend to know exactly what each carving meant to the people who made it. A snake cut into limestone may have carried fear, memory, warning, story, or something else entirely. A fox may have been an animal seen in the flesh, a figure in thought, a sign connected to a place, or a shape whose meaning has not survived. The important point is not to translate the carvings too quickly. The important point is that human attention had already moved from the living landscape into shaped stone. Near the beginning of settled life, people were not only tracking animals with their eyes and feet, they were also preserving animal forms on pillars that could remain long after the animal itself had passed from sight. This is one of the reasons Göbekli Tepe feels different from an ordinary camp. A camp is built around need, a hearth gives warmth, a hide gives cover. A tool cuts, scrapes, or pierces, but these stone spaces seem to gather the body in another way. They organize where people could stand, look, enter, and return. They create an inside, not exactly like the inside of a house, but like an inside of attention. To make such a space, people had to treat stone as more than material. They had to decide that its position mattered, that its height mattered, that its face and surface mattered. This does not require us to invent a lost civilization or a hidden science. It only requires us to take early humans seriously. The human mind did not begin with writing. The human need to gather around signs did not begin with cities. The body of our species had already walked through hundreds of thousands of years of landscape, danger, animal presence, death, kinship, and return before these pillars were raised. Those long, older experiences may have shaped the kind of attention that later entered the stones. A carved animal at Göbekli Tepe is not only an image, it is a trace of people who lived close enough to the non-human world that animals were not decoration. They were neighbours, threats, food, rivals, guides through seasons, and repeated presences in memory. This is why the architecture should be approached gently. If we call it simply a temple, we may make it too familiar. If we call it simply a monument, we may make it too cold. If we call it only a settlement, we may miss the way its stones seem to hold a different kind of gravity. The safest thought is that Göbekli Tepe was a complex place of gathering, building, marking, and return, with meanings that likely shifted over time. Its pillars stood in the land between daily survival and something harder to name. They remind us that early human beings were never only practical creatures, even when life demanded practicality every day. They lived by food, shelter, and weather, but also by attention, memory, and forms placed carefully into the earth. The T-shaped pillars are among the reasons Göbekli Tepe continues to feel so difficult to place inside a simple timeline. They are not enormous in the same way later pyramids or city walls are enormous, but they belong to a much earlier world, and that changes the weight of the question. A stone that seems modest beside later empires becomes extraordinary when it appears before those empires existed, before writing, before metal, before the large settled states that usually explain monumental labour. The shape itself invites caution. Some scholars have suggested that the T form may represent highly stylized human figures, especially because certain pillars show arms, hands, belts, or clothing-like details carved onto the stone. Yet even here, the careful path is better than the certain one. They may have referred to bodies, they may have marked presences, they may have carried social or symbolic meanings that do not fit neatly into later categories. What matters for the deeper story is that the stones were given form, position, and attention. They were not simply useful blocks placed to hold a roof. They stood as if the space around them had been arranged for looking, gathering, and remembering. This brings the mystery back to the beginning of human life in a very physical way. The earliest humans did not start by separating mind from environment. Thought grew inside movement, hunger, fear, animal watching, tool making, fire keeping, and the need to recognize patterns before danger arrived. A body that survives in such a world learns to notice shapes. It learns the curve of a track in mud, the shadow of a bird overhead, the difference between a safe stone and a cutting edge, the meaning of silence near water. At Göbekli Tepe, that old pattern-reading body seems to have placed some of its attention into architecture. The pillars make a space where signs are no longer only found in nature. They are made by human hands. The animal carvings deepen this feeling. They do not appear as random decoration in the modern sense. They belong to a world in which animals were central to survival and imagination at the same time. A wild boar was not an image for a wall. It was muscle, danger, meat, tusk, sound, and memory. A snake was not just a line in stone. It was movement close to the ground, a presence that could be feared, watched, avoided, or remembered. A bird could belong to the sky, to death, to distance, to migration, or to meanings we cannot safely recover. The carvings show that the people connected to this place were looking closely at the living world around them, but they do not give us permission to turn every figure into a fixed translation. Silence is part of the evidence. The stones speak through form, not through sentences. The spaces themselves also resist a single easy label. If they were only practical buildings, we might expect clearer signs of ordinary domestic life in the central story. If they were only empty monuments, we would miss the traces of repeated use, filling, rebuilding, and human presence over time. If they were only temples, we may be borrowing a later word that carries too much baggage from cities, priests, and organized religions that came long after. It may be safer to imagine them as places where gathering, memory, symbolic life, and social cooperation overlapped. That kind of place would not need to be one thing only. In early human history, the boundaries between survival, ritual, food, danger, and belonging may not have been drawn the way modern people draw them. A meeting around stone could also involve food. A carved animal could also carry memory of real animals. A built space could also change how a group understood itself. The mystery is not weakened by this caution. It becomes more honest. Göbekli Tepe asks us to see that early humans were already capable of building places where the body, the land, and the unseen meanings of life gathered together in stone. The difficulty with Göbekli Tepe is that every familiar word seems to arrive too late. If we call it a temple, we bring with us images from later worlds, priests, written prayers, fixed gods, organized calendars, and buildings designed for religions that left texts behind. If we call it a settlement, we bring another set of expectations: houses, storage rooms, family spaces, hearths, trash pits, and the small repeated marks of daily domestic life. If we call it a monument, we may make it too distant, as if it were only an object built to impress the eye. The stones seem to stand in the space between those words. They suggest gathering, but not in a way that can be reduced to ordinary shelter. They suggest meaning, but not meaning that can be translated into a simple sentence. They suggest social labour, but not a society we can describe with the confidence we would use for later kingdoms or cities. This is why the site remains so useful for thinking about the deep beginning of human history. It forces us to slow down before the categories we normally use. Early humans did not live in a world already divided into religion, economy, art, architecture, and politics. Those are later separations. For a person living close to the land, an animal could be food, danger, memory, sign, and story at the same time. A stone could be tool, boundary, weight, place marker, and shaped presence at the same time. A gathering could be practical, social, seasonal, and symbolic without those meanings being separated. The T-shaped pillars stand inside that older kind of world. They do not need to fit one modern box in order to matter. Their importance lies partly in the fact that they show human beings organizing space around something more enduring than immediate need. To raise a pillar is to decide that one piece of ground should be treated differently from another. To carve an animal into that pillar is to carry part of the living landscape into a still surface. To arrange several pillars in relation to one another is to create a space where bodies move differently, where attention is guided, where return becomes possible. None of this proves exactly what happened there, but it shows a level of shared action that cannot be ignored. Near the beginning of settled life, before the full weight of farming villages and later cities, people were already capable of making a place that held repeated human attention. That should change the way we imagine the people themselves. They were not waiting for civilization to make them thoughtful. They were already human in the ways that matter most for this question, able to remember together, able to shape material, able to give effort to something beyond the next meal, and able to leave traces that later ages would struggle to understand. The strange calm of the pillars comes from this distance. They stand without explaining themselves. Their carved animals do not tell us whether they were warnings, stories, symbols, companions, or presences of another kind. Their arrangement does not give us a written plan. Their burial does not hand us a single motive. Yet the absence of certainty does not make them empty. It makes them honest witnesses from a time before history had words. The beginning of human life was not silent because people lacked thought. It is silent to us because their thoughts were carried in bodies, gestures, places, and materials that only partly survived. Göbekli Tepe is one of those surviving materials. Its stones ask us to listen without forcing an answer too quickly. They ask us to notice how a human group, living near hunger and weather, could still create a place where stone, animal memory, shared labour, and time met under the open sky. The question of the heavy stone should be approached slowly, because weight can easily turn into exaggeration if we are not careful. At Göbekli Tepe, many of the standing limestone pillars were massive for their time, and some weighed several tons. The most famous number, the one that makes the mind pause, comes from an unfinished stone still lying in the quarry area, estimated at around 50 tons. This matters because it shows not only what people completed, but what they were capable of attempting. An unfinished stone is not a failure in the ordinary sense. For archaeology, it can be a rare kind of evidence. It remains close to the bedrock, still connected to the place where human hands began separating shape from earth. It lets us imagine the work before the final mystery of movement, before the raised pillar, before the finished space. There, in the quarry, the question becomes very physical. How does a human group without metal tools begin to free a large stone from limestone? How do hands using stone tools, wooden implements, fire perhaps in some contexts, wedges, impact, scraping, and repeated effort turn the living bed of the hill into a planned object? We should not picture a single dramatic moment. The more truthful image is slower. A line is chosen. A surface is worked again and again. Weaknesses in the rock are noticed. The shape is encouraged out of the bedrock by patient removal, dust gathers, chips scatter, tools wear down, hands become sore, people return after rest, after food, after sleep, after weather changes. A stone of many tons is not made by excitement. It is made by rhythm, repetition, and a shared decision that the task is worth continuing. This brings the mystery back to the human body. One body is fragile against stone. Skin breaks, muscles tire, breath shortens, a back can only bear so much. But many bodies, working in sequence, can extend the power of each person beyond individual strength. That is one of the oldest truths of our species. Early humans survived not because they defeated the earth alone, but because they could coordinate attention. They could watch, imitate, wait, help, remember, and return. The quarry makes that cooperation visible before the stone ever moves. To cut a large pillar, people needed more than force. They needed knowledge of the material, patience with tools, some shared expectation of the final shape, and enough social connection to keep labour gathered around a task that did not feed anyone immediately. Near the beginning of settled life, that is a striking thing. Food still had to be found, water still had to be carried, children still had to be watched. The sick and injured still made demands on the group. No one lived outside the limits of weather and hunger. So the decision to work stone must be understood within a world where energy was valuable. The stone was heavy, but the real weight may have been social. It required time taken from other tasks, bodies gathered in one place, and memory strong enough to continue the work beyond a single day. The unfinished stone, estimated at around 50 tons, becomes powerful for this reason. It does not prove that every raised pillar reached that weight. It should not be used that way. Instead, it opens a window into ambition, planning, and limits. It shows a horizon of possibility at the site. It shows that the people of this world were not merely using small tools and temporary shelters. They were looking at bedrock and seeing something that could be separated, shaped, and perhaps raised into a meaningful place. Whether the largest attempt was completed or not, the attempt itself tells us something quiet and important. Before machines enlarged human strength, before writing preserved instructions, before later states organized labor through command, People at Göbekli Tepe were already testing how far shared bodies could go against stone. To move a heavy pillar, the first challenge was not lifting. It was understanding that stone does not behave like a living body. A human body can bend, recover, shift weight, and protect itself from pressure. Stone gives no warning in the same way. It cracks where it is weak. It resists where it is solid. It can break after many days of work, or refuse to move after a group has already spent precious strength on it. This makes the quarry at Göbekli Tepe important, because it shows the work before the monument became a monument. The people who shaped these stones had to begin with the hill itself. They had to see where a pillar might be drawn from the limestone, how the surface could be separated, and how much material needed to be removed before the form could emerge. The tools were not metal. The work depended on stone against stone, on repeated blows, scraping, levering, and patient knowledge of the bedrock. In a modern mind, this may sound impossible only because we are used to machines doing the slow violence for us. But early humans had something machines do not have: deep attention to material, repeated over long time. This does not mean the work was easy. It means difficulty was met through rhythm. A stone surface could be worked little by little. A trench could be deepened. A shape could be freed gradually. A tool that dulled could be replaced. A worker who tired could step away while another continued. The power came not from one heroic body, but from many ordinary bodies arranged across time. That is the quieter truth behind the heavy stones. A pillar weighing many tons is not only a question of strength, it is a question of sequence. First the stone must be chosen, then it must be shaped. Then it must be separated from the bedrock, then it must be moved without breaking, then it must be raised or placed in relation to other stones. Each stage creates a new problem, and each problem requires a shared memory of the previous one. Near the beginning of settled human life, that kind of sequence tells us something important. These people were not acting randomly. They were not simply reacting to weather or hunger in the moment. They were capable of holding a goal across repeated days, perhaps across seasons, and perhaps across different groups of people who came together at the site. We do not need to imagine perfect organization. We do not need to invent rulers or armies. Cooperation can begin much earlier than the state. It can begin when people know one another well enough to work in rhythm, when a task has meaning enough to call them back, when food and time can be gathered around a shared effort. The body remains at the center of the story. Every meter of movement would have belonged to feet, shoulders, hands, ropes if they were used, wooden supports if they were used, and the careful management of friction and balance. A stone that lies flat is already dangerous. A stone that begins to slide becomes more dangerous. A stone raised upright demands control, not just force. This is why the question of the 50-ton unfinished stone should not be treated as decoration for the title. It opens the larger question of limits. The people of Göbekli Tepe were testing the boundary between what a human body cannot do alone and what many human bodies might do together. The largest unfinished stone remained in the quarry, and that fact is important. It keeps the story honest. It reminds us that ancient ambition also met resistance. Not every intention became a finished pillar. Not every stone left the bedrock. Failure, pause, change of plan, or abandonment may also belong to the archaeology of the place, but even an unfinished stone can teach us. It shows a scale of thought. It shows that someone saw a huge mass of limestone not only as earth, but as a possible object. Somewhere in that thought, the old human relationship with the world had shifted. The land was no longer only something to cross, hunt, gather from, and survive within. It was also something that could be cut, shaped, moved, and gathered into memory. The unfinished stone in the quarry does something that a completed pillar cannot do. A standing pillar shows us success, or at least the result of a successful stage of work. An unfinished stone shows us the edge where human intention met the resistance of the earth. It lies in the story like a held breath. The shape was begun, the mass was imagined as something separate from the bedrock, and the work moved far enough for us to recognize the attempt. Yet it did not become one of the raised stones. That incompleteness is not a weakness in the evidence. It is one of the most human parts of it. Early people were not magicians, and they were not machines. They lived with limits, Their tools broke, their bodies tired, their plans may have changed. A crack in the stone, a difficulty in moving it, a shift in the use of the place, a decision made by people whose names are gone. Any of these may have stopped the work. We do not need to know which one to understand the deeper point. At Göbekli Tepe, the human story is not only about what was finished, it is also about what was attempted. The estimated 50-ton block reminds us that ancient labour had a horizon of ambition. It shows a scale of thinking that reaches beyond a single body and beyond a single moment. A person can look at a small stone and see a tool. A group can look at a wall of limestone and see a future pillar. That shift matters. It means the land was being imagined before it was transformed. The stone first had to become a possible shape in the human mind before it could become a shaped object under human hands. Near the beginning of settled life, this is a quiet but powerful change. For most of human existence, survival had depended on following what the environment offered: animals moving through valleys, wild plants ripening in season, water appearing where the ground allowed it, shelter found or made from materials close at hand. But here, at this limestone ridge, people were not only accepting the land as it came, they were cutting into it, selecting from it, and trying to make it hold a meaning that would remain still. The tools were simple compared with later technology, but the thinking behind the work was not simple. To attempt a huge stone meant imagining a sequence before the sequence was complete. It meant seeing a finished form while the stone was still trapped in the hill. It meant trusting that many small actions could add up to one large change. This is one of the oldest roots of human cooperation. Our species did not become powerful because the individual body stopped being fragile. The body remained fragile. It still needed food, rest, warmth, water, and care. But human beings learned to stretch their limits through shared attention. One person strikes, another clears debris, another watches the line, another brings food, another remembers how the last stone fractured, another returns when the light is better. Across time, the work gathers more strength than any single person can hold. The quarry therefore becomes more than a place where stone was taken. It becomes a record of social possibility. The 50-ton unfinished stone is heavy in the physical sense, but it is also heavy in another way. It carries the weight of a question. What kind of human group could look at such a mass and begin? Not finish, not explain, not leave us a written answer, but begin. That beginning is enough to trouble the simple story that monumental thought arrived only after cities, kings, and written commands. At Göbekli Tepe, the trace is older and quieter. It suggests that before human beings built the great systems of later civilization, they had already discovered something more basic, that many limited bodies, gathered around a shared place, could push intention into stone and leave the earth changed. A human body standing before stone is always smaller than the task. That is where the next part of the mystery begins. It is easy to speak about pillars, quarries, and tons as if they were only measurements, but every measurement eventually returns to flesh. Someone had to bend near the limestone. Someone had to raise a tool again and again. Someone had to carry water, gather food, watch the weather, tend a fire, rest a tired hand, and return the next day. The stones at Göbekli Tepe were not moved by an idea alone. They were touched by skin, breath, muscle, bone, and patience. In the deep past, before machines widened human strength, the body was the first tool and the first limit. A shoulder could pull, but only so far. A hand could grip, but only until pain weakened it. A foot could hold against the ground, but only if the surface gave enough resistance. A group could push, drag, lift, guide, and steady, but every movement still had to obey weight, friction, balance, heat, thirst, and fatigue. This brings the ancient stones closer to us. We may live far from that world, but the body has not become unrecognizable. Anyone who has lifted something too heavy, walked too long, or felt the back tighten under strain can sense a small echo of the problem. Now enlarge that feeling across many bodies, many days, and many uncertain attempts. The question is no longer only how heavy the stone was. The question becomes how people organized living strength around something that resisted them completely. Near the beginning of settled life, human bodies were not weak in the modern sense of softness, but they were still biological bodies. They needed calories. They needed sleep. They could be injured. They aged. They carried children. They mourned the dead. Their strength was real but never unlimited. This matters because the stones do not prove that early humans were superhuman. They prove almost the opposite. They show what limited beings could do when limitation itself was answered by cooperation. One person against a pillar is almost nothing. Many people, sharing timing, direction, tools and purpose, become a different kind of force. This is one of the oldest patterns in human evolution. Long before stone circles, survival depended on bodies that could act together. Hunting required attention shared across distance. Gathering required knowledge passed through generations. Childcare required more than one pair of hands. Fire required maintenance. Camps required coordination. The group was not a luxury added after survival. The group was part of survival itself. At Göbekli Tepe, that older social body seems to have been turned towards stone. Instead of only following animals or collecting plants, people gathered around a task that held them to one place. Their muscles worked against a material that did not move easily. Their memory had to hold the sequence. Their patience had to survive repetition. A pillar could not be shaped by a single burst of effort. It required slow persistence, and slow persistence changes the meaning of labor. Work becomes a shared rhythm. The body learns where to stand, the hand learns where to strike, the group learns when to pause. The stone teaches by resisting. This is why the site feels so powerful without needing a dramatic story. It is not only a record of architecture, it is a record of the human body meeting something larger than itself and refusing to remain alone before it. The earliest roots of human history may be found in that refusal, not the refusal of death or hunger, but the quieter refusal to let one body remain the measure of all possible action. At Göbekli Tepe, stone made the human limit visible, and cooperation made that limit wider. The body does not meet stone only through strength. It meets stone through timing. This may be one of the quietest parts of the Göbekli Tepe problem. A heavy pillar cannot be argued with, hurried, or persuaded. It moves only when the forces around it are arranged correctly. Too little effort, and nothing changes. Too much force in the wrong direction, and the stone may shift dangerously or break. A body pushing alone feels the weight as failure. A group pushing together must learn to feel the same weight as a shared rhythm. That rhythm is not a small thing. It requires people to watch one another, to listen, to pause, to begin again, and to trust that the person beside them will not release at the wrong moment. Before written plans, before measured engineering diagrams, before metal pulleys or wheeled transport, such coordination had to live in bodies and memory. The work would have been held through gestures, calls, repeated practice, and the remembered lessons of previous attempts. This is where the ancient human body becomes more than muscle. It becomes part of a social instrument. A hand grips, but it also signals. A foot braces, but it also follows a rhythm. A back strains, but it also learns the angle that keeps a load from twisting. The eyes do not only look at the stone, they look at other bodies around the stone. In that shared attention, strength becomes organized. This is not unique to Göbekli Tepe. It belongs to the deeper human beginning. Long before people raised limestone pillars, humans had already survived through coordinated movement, surrounding animals, sharing meat, carrying children, maintaining fires, defending camps, and moving through difficult land together. The old roots of cooperation were already there. What Göbekli Tepe shows is that this cooperation could be turned toward a task that was not immediately edible, wearable, or portable. That is the difference. The same human capacity that once helped a group survive a dangerous hunt could also help a group shape a place of lasting memory. We should not romanticize the labor. It may have been exhausting. It may have been repetitive. It may have involved mistakes, injuries, and abandoned attempts. The people involved were not symbols. They were living bodies under sun, wind, cold, hunger, and fatigue. Their hands may have been calloused by many kinds of work, not only stone. Their shoulders may have carried food, water, wood, tools, children, hides, and baskets. Their lives were not organized around one monument alone. The stonework had to fit into the broader economy of staying alive. That makes the labour even more meaningful. Every hour given to cutting or moving stone had to exist beside the need to eat, rest, gather, and care for others. Near the beginning of settled life, this suggests a social world complex enough to hold more than immediate necessity. It suggests that people could gather enough time, food, trust, and purpose to work towards something that continued beyond the body's daily needs. The body is still the key. When modern people look at ancient stone, we often jump too quickly to technology. We ask what tool, what method, what hidden technique. Those questions matter, but they can make us forget that technology begins with human perception. Someone had to understand leverage not as a written principle, but as a feeling in the hands. Someone had to understand friction not as a formula, but as resistance under a dragging surface. Someone had to understand balance not as geometry on a tablet, but as the dangerous stillness before a stone tilts. Early people did not need modern language for physical knowledge in order to possess it. Their knowledge was practical, embodied, and tested directly by the world. At Göbekli Tepe, stone made that knowledge visible. It turned the human body into a measuring instrument for weight, slope, pressure, and time. And because no single body could master the task alone, it also turned many bodies into one careful, temporary machine of attention. The body leaves almost nothing behind when compared with stone. Muscle disappears, skin disappears, breath disappears the moment it is released. Even bone can break, scatter, or return slowly to the earth. Stone remains, with a different patience. This is why Göbekli Tepe can feel almost unfair to the people who made it. The pillars still stand or lie in fragments, but the tired hands that shaped them are gone. The quarry can still show the place where work began, but the voices that coordinated the work are gone. The carved animals can still be seen, but the living eyes that understood them in their own world are gone. What remains is the hard part of the story, while the soft human part has mostly vanished. Yet the soft part is where the mystery truly lived. A limestone pillar does not raise itself. A carved surface does not decide to be carved. A circle of stones does not gather purpose on its own. Behind every surviving stone was a chain of bodies that needed food, rest, warmth, trust, and memory. This is the human scale that should stay with us as we move deeper into the site. Near the beginning of settled life, people were not separated from the older animal condition. They still lived inside weather. They still followed the limits of hunger. Their children were vulnerable. Their elders carried knowledge but also frailty. Their tools extended the hand, but did not free the body from effort. If they worked stone, they worked it under all those conditions. This makes the achievement more grounded, not less remarkable. It was not the achievement of people beyond nature. It was the achievement of people inside nature, using the very social capacities that had helped humans survive for far longer than any monument had existed. Cooperation did not begin with temples. It began with life itself, sharing food, watching danger, learning routes, caring for children, remembering which plants ripened when, and noticing where animals passed after rain. The stonework at Göbekli Tepe seems to draw those older skills into a new form. Instead of cooperating only to solve the immediate pressures of the day, people cooperated around something that could outlast the day. This may be one of the deepest shifts in the human story. The group became able to spend living strength on lasting form. A person could grow tired and leave no trace, but the pillar could hold the memory of that effort without naming anyone. This is also why we should be careful when we imagine the builders. They were not a crowd of anonymous labourers in the later sense of state construction. They were not necessarily commanded by rulers in the way later monuments were often organised. We do not have evidence for that kind of system here. What we can say more safely is that the site implies coordination, planning, shared knowledge, and repeated work. Those things are already powerful. They show a social world deep enough to organise bodies around a place. The body, then, is not only a source of strength in this story, it is a source of meaning. People know weight because the body resists it. They know distance because the body crosses it. They know time because the body tires, sleeps, heals, grows older, and remembers. A heavy stone becomes meaningful partly because it is difficult for the body. If it were weightless, there would be no mystery of cooperation, If it could be raised by one person in a moment, it would not show the same depth of shared effort. The difficulty is what reveals the social body behind the individual body. Göbekli Tepe makes that visible in limestone. It shows early humans at the edge of a long change, still close to the first conditions of our species, yet already capable of placing many lives into a form that could survive them. The stones are not only heavy because of their mass, they are heavy because they carry the absence of everyone who touched them. To understand why Göbekli Tepe unsettles the usual story, we need to pause at the question of farming. For a long time, the human past was often told in a simple order. First people learned to farm, then they settled in villages, then food stores grew, then larger communities formed. Then, after enough surplus and organization, monuments appeared. This order is not entirely wrong for many later places, but Göbekli Tepe makes it less simple. The people connected to this site lived at a time when the old foraging world and the emerging settled world were overlapping. Wild resources still mattered deeply. Hunting and gathering had not vanished. Farming, where it appeared, was not yet the fully developed agricultural life of later villages and cities. This means the stones stand near one of the most delicate transitions in human history. They belong to a world in which people were beginning to gather more often in certain places, but had not yet entered the long settled order we usually associate with civilization. That is why the site feels so important. It suggests that large shared projects may not have waited for agriculture to become fully established. In some cases, the need to gather, remember, build, or mark a place may have been part of the same process that slowly pulled people toward more settled life. This does not mean a monument caused farming in a simple way. That would be too strong. But it does invite a careful thought. Human settlement may have grown not only from hunger and food storage, but also from social memory, repeated meetings, and places that became meaningful enough to draw people back. Near the beginning of this change, a community did not need to look like a city in order to hold complex obligations. People could return to a ridge because animals moved through the region, because plants ripened nearby, because water and stone were part of a known landscape, or because the place had already gained importance through earlier gatherings. Each return could make the next return easier to imagine. Each shared task could deepen the connection between people and ground. Over generations, a place that was once only visited might become more central. The human body is important here again. A mobile life keeps memory in the feet. A settled life places memory more heavily into the ground. Göbekli Tepe seems to sit between those two forms. It is not a fully urban place, but it is not merely a passing campsite either. It asks us to imagine people whose bodies still knew long movement, but whose attention was becoming tied to particular earth. A heavy stone cannot be carried casually from one temporary stop to another. It belongs to stillness. To shape such a stone is to accept that some part of human effort will remain where the stone remains. That is very different from a light tool, a woven basket, or a hide covering that can travel with the group. The pillars indicate a new relationship with place. They suggest that early people were beginning to invest labor in something that would not move with them. This may be one of the quiet turning points in the history of our species, the moment when memory began to grow heavier than the human body itself. The stones did not feed people directly. They did not walk with them. They did not follow the herds. They waited, and because they waited, people had to return if the place was to remain part of life. In that sense, the architecture may have helped create a kind of gravity, not physical gravity alone, but social gravity. A place marked by stone can call people back through obligation, memory, expectation, or shared meaning. We should not claim to know exactly which of these forces mattered most at Göbekli Tepe. But the site shows that before agriculture was fully settled into the later village world, humans were already capable of creating places that gathered time around them. The beginning of civilization may not have been a single invention. It may have been a slow knot tightening between food, season, memory, labor, and ground. The older story says that food came first, and meaning came later. It is a comfortable story because it feels practical. People needed to eat, so they learned to plant. Planting made them stay. Staying made villages. Villages made social order. Social order made monuments. But the world around Göbekli Tepe asks for a slower and less certain version. In this region, during the early Neolithic transition, people were living through changes that did not happen in one clean step. Wild cereals grew in the broader landscape. Animals were still hunted. Seasonal movements still mattered. Small settlements were appearing in parts of the region, but the full farming way of life was still developing. Human groups were experimenting with new relations to place before later agriculture became the dominant pattern. This means that food and meaning may not have stood in a simple line, one after the other. They may have grown together. A place that drew people for gathering, memory, or shared work could also create new pressures around food. If people came together more often, stayed longer, or returned in larger numbers, they would need to feed those bodies. They would need to know when plants ripened, where animals passed, where water could be found, and how much effort could be spent on a task that was not directly edible. The stonework, therefore, belongs to a broader human adjustment. It is not separate from hunger. It is built in the presence of hunger. It is not separate from the land. It is cut from the land. Near the beginning of settled life, this overlap matters deeply. The body still required daily care, but the social world was becoming heavy enough to pull bodies toward repeated places. Perhaps people gathered for reasons we might call ritual. Perhaps they gathered for exchange, meeting, feasting, memory, seasonal return, or obligations that left no written record. These possibilities do not cancel one another. In early human life, they may have belonged together. A gathering could feed people and remind them who they were. A shared meal could support labor. A marked place could help hold relationships between groups that did not live together all year. A stone circle could be practical in one sense and symbolic in another, without the people separating those meanings as we do. This is why Göbekli Tepe should not be forced into a single modern explanation. It is more useful as a window into a time when human life was becoming layered. The older foraging world had already produced detailed knowledge of plants, animals, tools, fire, and movement. The emerging, settled world would eventually produce houses, fields, storage, and denser communities. Between them lay a long threshold where people could still be mobile in habit, but increasingly attached to particular places. The stones belong to that threshold. They are too heavy for a world of pure movement, yet too early for the usual image of a city. They suggest a kind of social weight before full urban life. They show that humans could gather around a place strongly enough to change the ground, even while the food systems around them were still in transition. This connects directly to the larger human origin story. Our species did not become human only when we learned to farm. We had long been makers of tools, keepers of memory, watchers of animals, sharers of food, and builders of social bonds. Agriculture changed the scale and rhythm of life, but it did not create human meaning from nothing. At Göbekli Tepe, we see meaning already pressing against the edge of subsistence. The stones remind us that people can be drawn together not only by need, but also by remembered places, shared work, and the quiet desire to make something last. If farming later made villages heavier and more permanent, places like this may show an earlier gravity, a gravity of gathering before full settlement, a pull of stone before the full world of fields. The more we place Göbekli Tepe inside the early Neolithic transition, the more it becomes a question about what holds people together before the familiar supports of civilization are fully present. Later societies could use walls, fields, stored grain, inherited authority, written rules, and permanent houses to keep people near one another. But before those things became common, human groups still had ways of returning, cooperating, and remembering. These ways were older than agriculture. They belonged to kinship, seasonal knowledge, shared danger, food exchange, stories, repeated roots, and the trust built by surviving in the same difficult world. Göbekli Tepe seems to rise from that older ground, yet it also points towards something new. It shows a gathering place made heavy, visible, and difficult to ignore. A mobile group can leave behind a cold hearth and move on. A light shelter can be taken apart. A tool can travel in the hand, but a carved limestone pillar remains where it is. It asks people to come back to the place where effort was left behind. This is why the stones feel like a bridge between two ways of being human. On one side is the long past of movement, where the body follows animals, plants, water, and seasons. On the other side is the later world of settlement, where the ground itself begins to hold more of human life. Göbekli Tepe stands close to the crossing point, not because it explains the whole transformation, but because it makes that transformation visible in stone. The site suggests that human beings may have gathered for reasons that were not only practical in the narrow sense, yet those reasons still had practical consequences. If people came together, they needed food. If they worked, they needed rest. If they returned, they needed memory. If they built, they needed a shared sense that the place mattered. These things could strengthen one another slowly. A gathering could create the need for more reliable food. A shared labor could deepen attachment to a hill. A place marked by pillars could make future meetings easier to imagine. Over generations, the line between visiting and belonging could become less clear. This is not a simple claim that monuments created farming, or that farming created monuments. The safer thought is that both belong to a wider change in how humans related to place, time, and one another. Near the beginning of settled life, the human body was being drawn into new patterns. Feet that once measured long routes still remembered movement, but now certain places began to hold more weight. Hands that had made portable tools now shaped stone that could not travel. Memory that once lived mostly in paths, elders, and repeated seasons began to settle into built forms. A pillar cannot speak, but it can anchor return. A carved animal cannot explain itself, but it can hold attention across time. A filled space cannot tell us why it changed, but it can preserve the fact that people came back, worked, altered, and left traces for lives far beyond their own. This is the great importance of Göbekli Tepe in the story of human beginnings. It does not offer a clean origin point for civilization. Human history rarely begins so neatly. Instead, it shows a threshold, a place where old foraging knowledge, emerging settlement, shared labor, symbolic attention, and landscape memory seem to overlap. The people connected to the site did not need to be citizens of a city to act collectively. They did not need writing to hold meaning. They did not need metal tools to change stone. They did not need later institutions to create a place that mattered. What they did need was something older and more fundamental. Bodies able to gather, minds able to remember, and a social world strong enough to return to a difficult task. Beneath the earth, the stones preserve that quiet crossing, where human life began to grow heavier in one place, without yet becoming the world we call civilization. The carved animals at Göbekli Tepe should be approached as carefully as the stones themselves. They are among the most memorable features of the site, yet they are also among the easiest to misunderstand. A fox cut into limestone is not simply a fox in the modern sense of an image placed on a wall. A snake winding across stone is not simply decoration. A wild boar, a bird, a scorpion, or another creature belongs first to the living world that surrounded the people who made the carvings. These animals moved through the same landscapes, crossed the same ground, threatened the same bodies, and entered the same memories. For early humans, animals were not distant symbols separated from daily life. They were food, danger, sound in the night, tracks in the soil, movement at the edge of vision, and signs of season and place. This is why the carvings matter so much. They show that the people connected to Göbekli Tepe were not only shaping stone into architecture, they were also carrying the living environment into the surface of stone. Near the beginning of settled life, when human groups still depended deeply on wild resources, the animal world was part of the structure of thought. To know animals was to know where to walk, when to wait, when to hide, when to gather others, and when danger might be close. The body learned animals before the hand carved them. Feet followed tracks. Eyes read movement. Ears recognized sounds. Skin felt fear before thought became clear. When animal forms appear on the pillars, they may be echoes of that older bodily knowledge. But we must not translate them too quickly. It is tempting to say that one animal meant death, another meant protection, another meant power, and another meant a particular story. Some of those ideas may be possible in a broad sense, but the evidence does not give us a dictionary. The people who made these carvings left no written explanation beside them. Their meanings may have changed depending on time, group, place, or use. A creature carved on one pillar may not have meant exactly the same thing as a similar creature somewhere else. Silence is part of the truth here. The carvings let us see attention, but not certainty. That is already enough. In the deep human past, attention itself is evidence. It tells us what was worth noticing, what was worth repeating, what was worth fixing into a form that could last longer than a glimpse of movement in the grass. A real snake vanishes into stones or brush. A carved snake remains. A real fox appears and disappears with the light. A carved fox holds still across generations. This act of making the animal still may have been one way humans began to change their relationship with the living world. They were not only reacting to animals as they appeared, they were remembering them, arranging them, and placing them inside a built space. This connects back to the first human conditions. For most of our species' existence, survival depended on reading other life forms. Humans were never alone on an empty stage. They evolved among predators, prey, scavengers, birds, insects, plants, and changing habitats. The mind that later made symbols did not arise apart from that world. It grew inside it. Göbekli Tepe preserves a moment when that old attention to animals had entered stone. The carvings do not give us a simple answer about who the builders were, but they show us a human mind working at the border between nature and memory. They suggest that the stones were not silent blocks standing in a bare space. They were surrounded by forms of life, both carved and remembered, and each form pulled the human imagination back toward the land. The mystery is not only why people raised pillars, it is why those pillars carried animals from the world outside into a place that would later sleep beneath the earth. A carved animal on stone is different from an animal seen in motion. The living animal is never still for long. It appears, turns, listens, runs, hides, feeds, strikes, or vanishes into grass and shadow. The carved animal does something stranger. It stays. It holds one moment of attention long after the living body has moved away. At Göbekli Tepe, this stillness matters. The people who made the carvings lived in a world where animals were not background to human life. They shaped movement, fear, hunger, memory, and timing. To follow an animal was to follow a possibility of food. To hear an animal at night was to feel the body become alert. To see tracks near water was to understand that another life had passed there before. In such a world, animals were part of the deep grammar of survival. They taught humans how to read the land. They showed where danger might be waiting, where a herd had crossed, where a season was changing, or where a group might need to move next. When these animals appear on stone, they bring that older world into a fixed place. They suggest that the built spaces at Göbekli Tepe were not separate from the surrounding landscape, but somehow filled with it. The ridge, the stone, the wild creatures, and the people belong to the same field of attention. This is important because it keeps the mystery grounded. We do not need to imagine that every carving hides a secret code. We only need to understand that early humans were already making choices about what was worth preserving. A carved creature is a choice. It takes time. It uses skill. It marks a surface that could have been left plain. It tells us that someone, or some group, wanted that form to remain visible in that place. But why that creature, and why there, remains open. The answer may have depended on memories that did not survive, on stories told by firelight, on seasonal gatherings, on dangers known to the group, or on relationships between people and the animals around them. None of these possibilities should be turned into certainty too quickly. The value of the carvings is not that they let us read the mind of the builders directly. Their value is that they show the builders had minds filled with the living world. Near the beginning of settled life, this matters deeply. Human beings were beginning to make heavier places, but their imagination still came from a landscape of movement. They had not left the animal world behind, they carried it into stone. A wild boar carved into limestone may remind us that the boundary between food and threat could be thin. A snake may remind us of ground-level danger, sudden movement and attention close to the feet. A bird may remind us of distance, height, or the repeated presence of scavengers and sky. These are not translations. They are careful ways of staying close to the lived environment without pretending to know too much. The carvings also change the feeling of the pillars themselves. Without animals, the stones might seem abstract, almost silent in a geometric way. With animals, they become part of a wider world of bodies. The human body stands before stone. The animal body appears on stone. The land surrounds them both. In that arrangement, Göbekli Tepe becomes a meeting place between different kinds of life: the temporary life of humans, the moving life of animals, and the long still life of limestone. This is one reason the site feels so old and yet so intimate. It does not speak in writing, but it speaks through what humans noticed. It shows that before history had names, dates, or written explanations, people were already placing the creatures of their world into forms that could outlast memory. The animals on the pillars do not solve the mystery. They deepen it, because they show that the stones were not only heavy objects raised from earth. They were surfaces where an early human world of fear, attention, hunger, movement, and meaning became still. The animal carvings at Göbekli Tepe also remind us that early human thought did not begin in isolation. It began in a crowded world. The land was crowded with movement, with tracks, with wings, with teeth, with the sudden appearance of bodies that were not human. A person looking across that landscape did not see nature as something separate, quiet, or decorative. Nature was the condition of life itself. It could feed the group, injure the group, guide the group, or disappear when the season turned. In such a world, the boundary between observation and meaning may have been much thinner than it feels to us now. To notice an animal carefully was not only to look, it was to survive. To remember its behavior was to carry useful knowledge. To recognize its movement was to understand something about danger, weather, food, or place. When these creatures were carved into limestone, that old habit of attention became fixed in a form that could remain after the living animal was gone. This does not mean we can say exactly what the carvings meant. It means we can say that they belong to a world where animals mattered deeply enough to be brought into stone. That alone is important. A carving is not a footprint left by accident. It is a chosen mark. It takes time, skill, and intention. It changes the surface of a pillar that already required effort to make. The people who worked there did not leave us writing, but they left us choices, and those choices point back to the world they inhabited. The animals on the stones seem to pull the outside landscape into the built space. They make the pillars feel less like silent architecture and more like a meeting point between human memory and non-human life. Near the beginning of settled life, this meeting point matters. Humans were beginning to make places that stayed still, yet their minds and bodies still belonged to a world of movement. Herds moved, predators moved, birds crossed the sky, snakes passed through grass and stone. People moved too, following seasons, resources, and obligations. A carved animal gathers some of that movement into stillness. It takes what normally vanishes and holds it in one place. This may be one of the deepest qualities of the site. Göbekli Tepe did not simply raise stone above the ground. It placed a living world into stone, without giving us the key to unlock it. The result is not a solved message, but a preserved tension. The animals are visible, but their meanings are partly hidden. The pillars are solid, but the thoughts around them are gone. The site gives evidence, but not confession. That is why caution is not a weakness here. It is the only honest way to stay close to the past. If we fill every animal with a confident explanation, we make the stones speak in our voice instead of theirs. If we refuse to wonder at all, we flatten the human richness that the carvings clearly suggest. The better path is slower. We can see that people noticed animals, selected them, shaped them, and placed them on important stones. We can see that their world of survival was also a world of image and memory. We can see that early humans did not wait for cities, writing, or later religion before they began to turn the living environment into lasting signs. The carvings deepen the central question because they show that the stones were not only feats of labour. They were also surfaces of attention. They held the creatures that shared the land with human beings, creatures that had shaped fear, food, movement, and memory for countless generations. Later, when the place was covered beneath the earth, those animals also went into darkness. Stone held them there, quiet and unseen, until excavation brought them back into human sight. They returned to us without explanation, but not without force. They remind us that the first large human places may have carried the animal world inside them, as if the beginning of settlement still remembered the older world it had not yet left behind. The question of why Göbekli Tepe was covered is one of the most delicate parts of the whole story. It is also one of the easiest places to go too far. A buried site can tempt the imagination. It can make us think of secrets, sudden fear, hidden knowledge, or a dramatic ending. But the earth does not always cover things for one reason, and people do not always abandon places in one simple moment. At Göbekli Tepe, the evidence shows that some of the monumental spaces were filled in over time with soil, stone debris, animal bones, tools, and other material. This filling helped preserve the pillars, but it does not give us a single sentence explaining why it happened. That silence matters. It asks us to hold several possibilities without forcing one into certainty. A space may be filled because its use has ended. It may be covered as part of a change in practice. It may be renewed by building nearby or above older features. It may be closed intentionally. It may be altered slowly as generations treat the place differently. Some processes may have been deliberate, while others may have developed through repeated acts that no longer look clear to us. The word buried can make the event sound sudden, but the past often moves in layers. A handful of earth, a wall repaired, a space filled, a stone set aside, a new surface made, a new gathering arranged. These small acts can become archaeology after thousands of years. Near the beginning of settled life, such changes may have carried meanings we cannot easily recover. A place that once drew people together might later have needed to be closed, transformed, or remembered in another way. The people who filled those spaces may not have thought of themselves as erasing the site. They may have been continuing its life in a different form, or they may have been leaving it behind because the social world around it was changing. We do not know enough to choose one answer with confidence, but the very act of covering stone changes the feeling of the site. The pillars were made to stand, to hold space, to receive attention. Then, at some stage, they were surrounded and hidden by earth. A form that once organized human presence became invisible. This is the second great weight in the title. The first is the weight of stone. The second is the weight of burial. One asks how people raised the pillars. The other asks why a place shaped with so much effort would later disappear beneath the ground. To feel that question clearly, we should remember the human body again. A person working to fill a space does not perform an abstract act. Soil has weight, stones have weight. Debris must be carried, pushed, dropped, spread, and settled. Covering a place also takes labour. If the filling was deliberate, then the end of use required effort just as the beginning had required effort. If the filling happened through repeated alteration over time, it still shows that the site remained entangled with human action. Either way, the burial was not nothing. It became part of the life of the place. The earth that hid the pillars also protected them from later damage. Because they were covered, they could sleep beneath the hill while other forms of human life changed above and around them. Farming spread more widely. Villages grew. Later societies rose and vanished. Writing appeared. Metal tools appeared. Kingdoms appeared. The stones remained in darkness, not explaining themselves, not asking to be found. This is why the burial should not be treated as a cheap mystery. It is deeper than that. It shows how human meaning can pass out of memory even when material survives. A community may know why a place matters. Their children may know a different version. Later generations may only know the hill. After enough time, even a great effort can become ground again. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that history is not only built, it is also covered, forgotten, preserved, and misunderstood. To cover a place is not always to erase it. Sometimes covering can be a way of ending, protecting, changing, or carrying memory into another form. This is why the earth above Göbekli Tepe should not be treated only as a curtain pulled over a secret. It may be better to imagine a long human relationship with the same ground, changing slowly as the people around it changed. A space that once stood open might later become filled because its role was complete. Another space might be built nearby. A pillar might remain visible for a time, then gradually become enclosed by debris, stone, and soil. A place could be closed with care, or it could be absorbed into new activity. The evidence does not allow one simple motive, but the filling itself tells us that the site did not simply vanish in a single empty instant. It passed through human hands, human choices, and perhaps many different stages of use. This is important because early human places were not frozen. They lived through time. A gathering place could change as groups changed. A stone arrangement could be repaired, altered, filled, or replaced. What looks to us like a burial may have been experienced by people then as transition. We should be careful not to give them our modern feeling of loss too quickly. To us, covering carved stone seems strange because we value exposure. We want monuments to remain visible. We want ancient things to stay open so they can be seen, photographed, studied, and named. But early people may not have thought that visibility was always the highest form of respect. A place could matter even when hidden. A memory could remain powerful even if a surface was covered. A closing act could be meaningful in ways we cannot easily recover. Near the beginning of settled life, when people were still learning new relationships with permanent ground, closing and filling may have belonged to the same slow process as building and returning. The human body again helps make this real. Filling a space is work. It takes repeated movement. Soil must be gathered. Stones must be carried. Loose material must be thrown, spread, or packed. If the act was deliberate, then people did not only invest labour in raising pillars, they also invested labour in making them disappear from view. That is a powerful thought, but it should remain open. It may not have been one dramatic day when everyone decided to bury a temple. It may have been a gradual process, a series of changes, or a mixture of practical and meaningful acts. A place can be transformed without a single final ceremony. It can fade in layers. Still, the result is remarkable. Heavy stones that once shaped human attention became part of the hill. Animal carvings that once faced open air entered darkness. Spaces where people may have gathered became packed with material. The earth turned architecture into archaeology. This change connects back to the larger human story. For most of our existence, humans lived in ways that left light traces. Hearths, bones, tools, post holes, ash, disturbed soil, much disappeared. At Göbekli Tepe, paradoxically, the covering helped preserve what might otherwise have been more exposed to damage. The hiding became a form of survival for the stones, whether or not preservation was intended. This is one of the cold truths of archaeology. The past often reaches us not because it stayed alive in memory, but because it was buried, sealed, forgotten, or left undisturbed. Human meaning can vanish while material remains. A story can disappear while a wall survives. A place can lose its name and still keep its shape beneath the earth. Göbekli Tepe rests inside that strange condition. It is famous now because it was hidden for so long. The soil that made it silent also helped make it available to the future. When we ask why the temple was buried, we are also asking how human memory changes after the people who made it are gone. What once required bodies, voices, and attention became a quiet mound. The hill kept the stones, but not the reasons. It preserved the question while letting the answer drift away. The burial of Göbekli Tepe is powerful because it turns the site into a question about endings. Human beings often build as if building is the important act, but archaeology reminds us that ending a place can be just as meaningful as beginning it. A structure is not only born when the first stone is raised, it also changes when people stop using it, alter it, cover it, build beside it, or remember it differently. At Göbekli Tepe, the filling of the monumental spaces gives the site a second life beneath the ground. What had once been open to bodies, light, wind, and attention became enclosed by earth and debris. The pillars did not disappear because they were destroyed completely. They disappeared because the hill took them back. This is the strange calm at the center of the story. The same human world that had drawn stone out of the limestone ridge later allowed stone to return into darkness. We should not imagine this as a single theatrical moment unless the evidence demands it, and it does not. It may have happened through repeated acts, changes of use, rebuilding, closing, or gradual filling across time. But even when we speak carefully, the result remains remarkable. A place that required gathering, strength, memory and planning became hidden from sight. A space shaped by people became part of the landscape again. This is not only an archaeological puzzle, it is a human one. Early humans lived close to cycles. Fires were lit and died down. Camps were made and left behind. Animals came and passed. Plants ripened and vanished. Bodies grew, aged, and returned to the earth. In such a world, perhaps the ending of a place was not always a failure. Perhaps closing, covering, or transforming a space belonged to the same deep rhythm as making it. We cannot say this as certainty, but we can hold it as one careful possibility. A place may have a time of use, and then a time of silence. A stone may stand, and then be hidden. A memory may be held by a group, and then slowly change as the group changes. Near the beginning of settled life, this would have mattered in a special way. People were learning how to attach themselves more strongly to particular ground, but the old habits of movement and change had not disappeared. A hill could be remembered, remade, and later left to become something else. The filling of Göbekli Tepe may therefore mark not a simple abandonment, but a transformation that we can see only from the outside. The people who placed material into those spaces, if that is what they did, may not have thought they were burying history. History is our word. They may have been completing a cycle, making room for another use, closing an older space, stabilizing a structure, or following practices whose meaning was clear to them and lost to us. The cold truth is that material can survive while meaning does not. The stones remained, the reasons thinned out and vanished. This is one of the quiet losses of human evolution and deep history. Our species became able to build memory outside the body, in stone, tools, places, and marks. Yet those external memories still needed living people to explain them. Once the chain of explanation broke, the object remained but the voice disappeared. Göbekli Tepe shows that loss with unusual force. It gives us pillars, carvings, fill, walls, and quarry traces, but not the words that join them together. It gives us the body of the question, but not its breath. When the site was covered, intentionally or through layered human activity over time, the silence became deeper. The hill preserved what people had made, while hiding the reasons from later eyes. For thousands of years, the stones rested under soil as human life changed beyond recognition. This is why the burial should not be treated as a simple secret. It is a reminder that human beings can create something large enough to survive and still leave behind a mystery, because survival of stone is not the same as survival of meaning. It is tempting to speak about Göbekli Tepe as if a civilization appeared, built a mysterious place, and then vanished. That kind of sentence is powerful, but it is also too simple. It brings the wrong image into the mind. A civilization, in the usual sense, suggests cities, rulers, social classes, written records, large systems of administration, and a clear political world. Göbekli Tepe belongs to something older, quieter, and harder to name. The people connected to it were not part of a known lost empire. They did not leave behind royal names, palace archives, armies, or stories written on tablets. What disappeared was not a kingdom in the later sense. What disappeared was a way of gathering, building, remembering, and relating to a place before history had the tools to describe itself. That is a deeper kind of disappearance. A city can fall and still leave walls with names. A kingdom can end and still leave inscriptions about its rulers, but a community before writing can vanish almost completely from memory while leaving only stone, soil, tools, animal bones, and altered ground. This is why Göbekli Tepe should not be treated as proof of a hidden advanced world. Its wonder is already strong. Without that, the wonder is that human groups near the beginning of settled life could organize enough labor, attention, and shared meaning to create a place that later generations forgot in detail. They changed the earth, but the explanation of that change did not survive. Near the beginning of the human story as we can see it archaeologically, this kind of loss was normal. For most of our species' existence, people lived without writing. Their knowledge moved through voice, gesture, imitation, memory, and repeated practice. A child learned where to walk because someone showed them. A hunter learned animal movement by watching others. A toolmaker learned stone by touch and correction. A group remembered places through return, stories, and shared experience. But this kind of memory is fragile. It depends on living bodies. When bodies die, when groups move, when language changes, when practices stop, whole worlds can fade without leaving a written explanation behind. Göbekli Tepe sits inside that fragile condition. Its stones lasted, but the living chain that explained them did not. That is why the phrase vanished civilization should be replaced with a more careful thought: a vanished pattern of life. A pattern can vanish even when people themselves continue in some broader human sense. Practices change, meeting places lose meaning, new ways of living appear, food systems shift, communities grow, move, merge, or divide. The old reasons for returning to a hill can become less important as new obligations form elsewhere. In that way, disappearance may not mean catastrophe. It may mean transformation. It may mean that the world around the site changed slowly until the older form of gathering no longer held the same place in human life. This does not make the story less mysterious. It makes it more human. People rarely know, while they are living through change, which parts of their world will be remembered and which will vanish. A practice that feels central to one generation may become unclear to another. A place that once held meaning may later become only a mound. A carved animal that once carried memory may become an image without a key. The human past is full of these broken bridges. At Göbekli Tepe, the break is unusually visible because the material remains so strong and the explanation is so thin. Heavy pillars, shaped spaces, animal carvings, quarry traces, and filling material remain before us, but the social world that gave them sense has slipped away. This is the true disappearance at the heart of the site. Not a vanished empire of fantasy, but a vanished way of making meaning before writing, before cities, before the forms of civilization that later taught history how to speak. A vanished pattern of life can be harder to imagine than a vanished city. A city leaves behind a shape that later people can recognize. Streets, walls, rooms, gates, storage spaces and graves all help the mind rebuild a lost world. But the deeper human past often leaves something less complete. It leaves a work stone without the voice that explained it. It leaves an animal carving without the story that gave it force. It leaves a filled space without the reason for closing it. Göbekli Tepe belongs to that older kind of disappearance. The people connected to the site may not have vanished in the sense of being suddenly destroyed. Their descendants, neighbors, or related communities may have continued living, changing, moving, and joining the wider transformations of the early Neolithic world. What disappeared was the exact social arrangement that made the hill matter in that particular way. A place can lose its role without the people themselves ending in catastrophe. This is one of the quieter truths of history. Human life changes by replacement, forgetting, adaptation, and drift, not only by disaster. A gathering that once felt necessary may become less central. A route once followed every season may shift. A practice once repeated with care may no longer be taught. A stone space once filled with attention may become difficult to understand, even for later generations living near it. Near the beginning of settled life, such changes may have been especially deep. People were experimenting with new ways of staying, returning, storing, building, and relating to the land. No one at the time could have known which practices would become the foundation of later village life and which would fade into soil. That uncertainty makes Göbekli Tepe more human. It shows a world in motion, not a finished civilization standing still. The stones were stable, but the society around them was not frozen. Food systems were changing. The relationship between mobility and settlement was changing. The ways people gathered may have changed as groups became more tied to particular places, or as new forms of daily life became more important. In that wider transformation, an older gathering place could lose the reason that once kept it alive. The hill did not have to be destroyed for its meaning to fade. It only had to stop being renewed by living people. This is where memory becomes fragile. A pillar can remain upright, but if no one tells its story, its meaning begins to loosen. A carved animal can remain visible, but if the gestures, songs, warnings, or shared understandings around it are no longer carried forward, it becomes an image without its original breath. Human memory depends on repetition. It survives when people return, speak, teach, imitate, and care. When those repetitions stop, even a massive stone can become mute. This is why the idea of a vanished pattern is more honest than the idea of a vanished empire. It keeps the wonder without inventing what we do not know. It allows the site to be strange in the way the evidence actually supports. Strange because it was early, large, carefully made, repeatedly used or altered, and later covered. Strange because it shows organized human effort before the usual markers of civilization. Strange because the material survived, while the social world around it slipped out of reach. The beginning of human history was full of such losses. For most of our species' existence, people carried their worlds inside living communities. Their laws, if we can use that word carefully, were not written in books. Their memories were not stored in archives. Their knowledge survived in bodies, voices, roots, habits, and shared attention. When those living chains broke, the past became difficult to recover. Göbekli Tepe gives us one of the rare places where the material chain remained strong even after the living chain disappeared. That is why it feels like a message and a silence at the same time. It tells us that early humans were capable of building around meaning, but it does not tell us exactly what that meaning was. It shows us that something once held people together on a limestone ridge, and then that way of being together changed, leaving stone to remember what people no longer could. The disappearance of an old way of life is often quiet. It does not always leave ashes, broken walls, or a final day that can be named. Sometimes it happens through a change in rhythm. People stop returning as often. A place that once gathered bodies becomes less necessary. A practice that once felt natural is no longer taught with the same care. Children grow into a world where other places matter more. New forms of food, settlement, and daily obligation begin to pull attention elsewhere. The hill remains, but the living pattern around it loosens. This may be the most careful way to think about Göbekli Tepe, not as the ruin of a lost empire, but as the material trace of a human arrangement that no longer continued in the same form. The stones stayed in the earth. The people changed. Their descendants, neighbours, or related communities may have moved into other ways of living, other patterns of settlement, other relationships with animals, plants, tools, and ground. Nothing in this requires a dramatic collapse. A world can end by becoming another world. That is one of the slowest and most common forms of loss in human history. Near the beginning of settled life, such changes would have been especially deep, because the basic shape of human existence was shifting. For countless generations, people had lived by movement, return, memory, and close knowledge of wild landscapes. Then, slowly and unevenly, some groups began to stay longer, gather differently, build heavier, store more, and form stronger ties to particular places. In that broad change, some older forms of gathering may have become less central. A stone place that once held strong meaning could become an older layer beneath newer habits. A carved animal that once belonged to a shared understanding could become a mark whose explanation no longer moved through living voices. This is not failure in a simple sense. It is transformation. Human beings do this constantly, even in later times with writing and records. We leave behind customs, names, roads, songs, tools, houses, and ways of speaking that once felt permanent to someone. The deeper past only makes this loss harder to recover, because fewer bridges remain. At Göbekli Tepe, the bridge is made of limestone, not language. We can follow the stones, but not the full meaning that joined them. We can see shaped pillars, filled spaces, carvings, quarry traces, and signs of repeated human work. We can understand that the place mattered, but we cannot stand inside the minds of the people who made it. We cannot hear what was said when a pillar was raised, or when a space was filled, or when a child first learned that the hill was different from ordinary ground. This distance is not something to hide from the listener. It is the heart of the story. The honest mystery is not that a magical civilization vanished. The honest mystery is that a real human world, capable of effort and meaning, left enough for us to see its outline, but not enough for us to fully enter it. That is a colder and deeper thought. It reminds us that history is not only a record of what people achieved, it is also a record of what cannot be carried forward forever. The human body dies. The voice stops. The group changes. The practice fades. Stone remains, but stone does not remember in the way people do. It keeps shape, not explanation. Göbekli Tepe therefore becomes a kind of boundary between presence and absence. It is present in its material, absent in its original meaning. It shows us that early humans were already creating places of lasting force, while also showing us how easily the reasons for those places can pass away. The buried hill does not need a vanished kingdom to feel profound. Its depth comes from something more familiar and more universal, the way human beings make meaning together, and the way time slowly separates that meaning from the things they leave behind. Göbekli Tepe unsettles the older story because it refuses to stay in the proper order. The simplest version of human history once moved like a staircase. First came hunger and wandering, then came farming, then came villages, then came leaders, storage, organized labor, and finally the great works of stone. In that staircase, monuments belong near the top, after the practical problems of survival had already been solved in a stable way. But the limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia makes the staircase less certain. Here, near the early edge of settled life, we find a place where people, without writing, without metal tools, and without the later machinery of states, still shaped large stones, arranged spaces, and carved animals into pillars. The site does not destroy everything we know about the past. It does not prove that history must be replaced by fantasy. Its effect is quieter and more important. It asks us to make the old story more complex. Human beings may not have waited for full agriculture and cities before gathering around large shared projects. They may have been drawn towards certain places by memory, season, animals, food, exchange, obligation, or meanings that are now partly lost. In that drawing together, new social possibilities could appear. A group that returns to one hill begins to carry that hill differently in the mind. A group that works stone together begins to create time that is not only about immediate hunger. A place marked by pillars can become a center before it becomes a city. This changes how we think about civilization at its beginning. Civilization was not a switch turned on by farming alone. It was a long and uneven change in the relationship between bodies, land, memory, and labor. Farming mattered deeply, but it was not the only force that made humans gather. Food feeds the body, but shared places hold the group. A stored harvest can keep people near one another, but so can obligation, ceremony, remembered meetings, or the repeated labor of shaping a place that everyone recognizes. We should not force Göbekli Tepe to answer every question about this change. It is one site in a broad and complicated region, not the single origin of everything that followed, but it gives us a powerful warning against simple explanations. The human story did not move from practical life to meaningful life, as if early people first survived and only later became symbolic. Meaning was already present inside survival. An animal track could be practical and meaningful. A fire could warm the body and gather memory. A hill could be a landmark, a meeting place, a source of stone, and something more difficult to name. The pillars make this overlap visible. They show early humans not as creatures waiting for civilization to begin, but as people already living with attention, cooperation, and a capacity to turn the landscape into shared memory. This matters because the stones were not light. They did not appear by accident. They required decisions that lasted beyond a single moment. Even if we remain careful about exact purposes, the evidence points toward planning and repeated work. That alone bends the usual picture. It shows that social complexity can grow before the signs we expect are fully present. It shows that human groups can organize around a place before there is writing to record the reason. It shows that a community can leave behind something large enough to reshape modern thinking, while still remaining mostly silent about itself. Near the beginning of settled life, the human path was not a straight road from hunger to farming to monuments. It was a braided path, where food, fear, stone, animals, memory, labor, and gathering moved together through time. The lesson of Göbekli Tepe is not that the old story was foolish. It is that the old story was too smooth. Human beings rarely move through history in clean steps. The shift from mobile foraging to more settled life did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not happen for only one reason. It was a long change made of climate, plants, animals, water, memory, social ties, and repeated choices. A group might stay longer in one place because resources were good. Another group might return because the land was known. Others might gather because a place had become important through earlier meetings. Over time, those returns could thicken into new habits. What Göbekli Tepe adds to this picture is the weight of shared meaning before the full world of later civilization. It shows that human beings were capable of making a place matter deeply before writing could name it, before kings could command it, and before cities could surround it. This is why the stones are so important. They do not simply say that early people could build. They say that early people could organize life around something that stayed. A heavy pillar is not like a tool carried from camp to camp. It changes the ground into a point of return. It creates a place where effort has already been spent, where memory can gather, where the group can recognize something made by hands larger than any one person. Near the beginning of settled life, that is a major change in human experience. The body, which had long followed movement across the landscape, began to leave more of itself behind, not literally in flesh, but in labor, shape, arrangement, and mark. This does not mean people stopped moving suddenly. It means the relationship between movement and place became more complicated. A person could still know long routes, wild plants, animal behavior, and seasonal change, while also belonging to certain fixed points in the land. Göbekli Tepe sits inside that tension. It belongs to people close to the old human beginning, but it also points toward the heavier worlds that would come later. The site also changes how we think about intelligence in the past. Modern people often confuse technology with thought. Because early tools were simple compared with machines, we may unconsciously imagine early minds as simple too, but the stones resist that mistake. To shape limestone, arrange pillars, carve animals, and fill or transform built spaces over time requires observation, memory, skill, and cooperation. It does not require modern science, but it does require deep practical knowledge. It does not require writing, but it does require shared understanding. It does not require a city, but it does require enough social force to hold people together around a difficult task. The result is a different image of early humanity. Not primitive people waiting in darkness for civilization to arrive, and not a lost advanced culture hiding behind the evidence, but real human groups living at a turning point, carrying older foraging knowledge into new relationships with place. That image is calmer, but also stronger. It respects what the evidence can support. It allows the site to be remarkable without making it false. When we ask who raised the stones, the answer may not be a single people with a single name. It may be communities whose identities are beyond our reach, people connected by land, practice, memory, and repeated gathering. When we ask why the place was buried, the answer may not be one secret act. It may be a long transformation, a closing, a filling, a renewal, or a loss of use across time. The importance of Göbekli Tepe is that it teaches us to accept complexity near the beginning. Human history did not begin with perfect explanations. It began with bodies on land, hands on stone, animals in memory, and places slowly becoming too meaningful to remain ordinary. Göbekli Tepe does not give us a neat ending to the old story of human beginnings. It gives us a more careful beginning. It asks us to stop imagining early history as a ladder, where each step must be completed before the next can appear. Human life was not that orderly. The same people could carry very old knowledge and also take part in something new. They could know the movement of animals, the ripening of wild plants, the feel of stone under a tool, and the changing air before rain, while also helping shape a place that would outlast every living body around it. That overlap is what makes the site so important. It does not belong fully to the wandering world before settlement, and it does not belong fully to the later world of villages, fields, rulers, and written memory. It stands in between, where human beings were beginning to make certain places heavier with return, labor, and attention. The stones changed the question from a simple, "When did civilization begin?" to something deeper. What if the beginning was not one event? What if it was a long gathering of small changes? A hill remembered more often, a group returning with greater purpose, a stone shaped with more care, a carved animal placed where others could see it, a space filled and transformed when its use had changed. In that kind of beginning, no single invention explains everything. Farming matters, but it is not alone. Tools matter, but they are not alone. Social memory matters, the body matters. The landscape matters. The need to meet, to remember, to mark, and to return also matters. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that human beings became human not by escaping nature all at once, but by slowly changing the way they lived inside it. They took stone from the ridge, but the ridge still shaped what was possible. They carved animals, but those animals still came from the living world around them. They made spaces, but those spaces still depended on food, water, weather, and cooperation. Nothing here floats above survival. Everything is tied back to it. Yet survival alone does not explain the site either. If survival were the only force, the heavy stones would be hard to understand. A lighter shelter would be easier. A portable tool would be more practical. A simple camp would demand less labour. The presence of the pillars shows that something in human life was already reaching beyond immediate use. Not beyond the body, because the body did the work. Not beyond the land, because the land gave the material, but beyond the narrow moment of hunger and rest. Early humans were already making forms that could hold attention longer than a day. That is the quiet turn. The stones do not tell us that ancient people were just like later city builders. They tell us that some of the roots of later civilization were older than cities. Cooperation was older. Symbolic attention was older. Repeated return was older. Shared labour around a meaningful place was older. The later world of temples, towns, fields, and written records did not appear from emptiness. It grew from capacities that had been forming in human groups for a very long time. Göbekli Tepe makes those capacities visible in limestone. It shows us people without writing, yet not without memory. People without metal, yet not without skill. People without known kings, yet not without organization. People without cities, yet not without places that mattered. That is why the site changes the story without needing to overturn it completely. It does not replace evidence with fantasy. It makes the evidence wider. It asks us to imagine early human history as a braided path, where hunger, stone, animal life, landscape, social memory, and the first weight of belonging moved together. The buried hill does not answer every question, but it teaches us that the beginning of civilization was not a clean doorway. It was a long threshold, crossed slowly by living bodies that left their effort in the earth. What remains after all these questions is not a simple solution, but a quieter lesson about human beings. Göbekli Tepe is often powerful because it seems to stand at the edge of what we expect. It is older than the cities that usually explain monuments. It belongs to people who lived before writing, before metal tools, before the familiar machinery of later states. Yet it does not point to fantasy. It points to something more difficult and more honest. The deep ability of humans to gather around meaning before they could preserve that meaning in words. This is where the buried stones become more than an archaeological puzzle. They become a mirror held far back in time. A human being is small beside a limestone pillar. A life is short beside a hill. A voice fades quickly beside a carved surface. But when people gather, remember, work, and return, they can place part of themselves into the earth. That is what the stones seem to show, even if they do not tell us the full reason. They show that early humans were already carrying a social world inside them. Not a world of written laws or royal commands, but a world of attention, obligation, shared labour, and remembered places. Near the beginning of settled life, this was already enough to change a ridge. The old human body, still close to hunger, weather, animals, and fatigue, could not lift history alone. But many bodies together could leave a mark strong enough to survive the loss of their names. This may be one of the most important truths of the site. The people connected to Göbekli Tepe did not need to become modern for their lives to have depth. They did not need writing for memory to matter. They did not need metal for skill to exist. They did not need cities for cooperation to become large. Their world was different from ours, but not empty. It was filled with land, animal movement, stone, seasonal knowledge, danger, food, children, death, and return. The pillars grew out of that world, not outside it. This helps us avoid two mistakes. The first mistake is to make the builders too primitive, as if people before farming villages had only immediate needs and no larger imagination. The second mistake is to make them too mysterious in the wrong way, as if every unexplained stone must belong to a lost advanced civilization. Göbekli Tepe asks for a middle path. The people were fully human, but not modern. Skilled, but not mechanical. Socially complex, but not necessarily urban. Capable of meaning, but not available to us in full explanation. That middle path is slower, but it is more respectful to the evidence. It lets the mystery remain without turning it into a false certainty. It also brings the story closer to the listener. Because the deeper question is not only why they built, or why the place was covered, it is what kind of creature a human being is. We are animals that tire, hunger, fear, and die. But we are also animals that gather around places, carry memory beyond one body, and make signs that outlive the hands that made them. The stone circles of Göbekli Tepe remind us that the roots of civilization may not begin with power alone, or with food alone, or with technology alone. They may begin wherever human beings learn to give shared attention to something larger than the day. A hill becomes more than a hill. A stone becomes more than stone. A place becomes heavy with return. Then time passes, the voices disappear, and the earth keeps what it can. The lesson becomes clearer when we think about what the earth can keep and what it cannot. The earth can keep stone if stone is buried gently enough. It can keep cut marks, broken tools, animal bones, charcoal, walls, and the shape of spaces where people once gathered. It can keep the weight of a pillar long after the hands that touched it have vanished. But the earth cannot keep everything. It cannot keep the exact sound of a voice explaining why a carving mattered. It cannot keep the feeling of a group arriving at the ridge after a long walk. It cannot keep the quiet agreement that made people return, or the memories that may have passed between older and younger members of a community. Archaeology begins with what remains, but human life was always larger than what remains. Göbekli Tepe teaches this with unusual force. The stones are large, but the missing life around them is larger. The pillars still carry form, but not full explanation. The carved animals still hold shape, but not the complete world of fear, hunger, respect, memory, and attention that once surrounded them. This is not a failure of the site. It is a truth about the human past. Most of what people were is gone. Their breath is gone. Their gestures are gone. Their daily conversations are gone. Their ordinary care for one another is gone. Yet something survived, and that something is enough to slow the mind. Near the beginning of settled life, people placed labour into a ridge in a way that made the ridge different. They did not leave us a written message, but they left a problem that still asks for humility. The problem is not only technical, it is moral in a quiet sense. How do we speak about people who cannot correct us? How do we wonder without inventing? How do we respect mystery without filling it with claims that the evidence cannot carry? Göbekli Tepe is valuable not because it lets us say anything we want, but because it teaches the opposite. It teaches restraint. It reminds us that the past was real before it became our story. The people who shaped those stones did not live in order to become a mystery for us. They lived inside their own weather, hunger, kinship, effort, and memory. Their world had its own centre, even if we can only see the edges. This should change the way we look at ancient places. A buried site is not only an opportunity for wonder, it is also a responsibility. Each stone asks to be read carefully. Each silence asks not to be abused. The strongest history is not the loudest history. It is the history that can hold uncertainty without becoming empty. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe gives something useful to the present. It shows that human beings have always needed more than survival, but it also shows that survival was never absent from meaning. The builders did not float above hunger. They worked within it. They did not escape the body. They used the body. They did not defeat time. They placed something into time and lost the words around it. That is a lesson for anyone listening in the quiet hours. What we make may last longer than we do, but it may not carry our reasons clearly. Our lives are held in gestures, care, labour, and places that others may only partly understand. The stones of Göbekli Tepe do not answer every question, but they invite a slower kind of attention, one that sees early humans not as shadows, but as people standing at the deep edge of memory. In the end, Göbekli Tepe does not leave us with a closed answer. It leaves us with a slower kind of understanding. 12,000 years ago, near a turning point in human life, people stood on a limestone ridge and changed it. They cut stone from the earth. They shaped pillars. They carved animals. They gathered around spaces whose full meaning has not survived. Some stones were raised. One unfinished stone in the quarry still points toward an ambition measured in many tons. Later, the place was covered, transformed, and hidden beneath the ground. These facts are already enough. They do not need to be made louder than the evidence allows. The real force of the story comes from how much it shows and how much it refuses to explain. We can see the labour, but not the voices. We can see the pillars, but not the complete purpose. We can see animal forms, but not the stories that once surrounded them. We can see the filled spaces, but not the final reasons for their covering. This is why the site remains so deeply human. It is made of both presence and absence. The stones are present, the people are absent. The work is present, the meaning is partly absent. And between those two conditions, we begin to understand something about our species. Human beings are creatures who live briefly, but often act as if something should continue after them. We gather around places. We mark the earth. We remember through objects, paths, rituals, shelters, graves, songs, and stories. Sometimes we know exactly why we do this. Sometimes the reason is only clear to the people living inside the moment. Later generations inherit the material, but not always the key. Göbekli Tepe is one of the oldest and clearest reminders of that fragile exchange. It shows that long before written history, people were already placing effort into forms that could outlast the body. Near the beginning of settled life, they were not simply waiting for civilization to arrive. They were already carrying some of its deepest roots: cooperation, shared attention, symbolic life, and a growing attachment to certain places. But the site also reminds us that no human achievement is fully protected from time. A monument can remain and still become silent. A place can be preserved and still lose its first explanation. A carved animal can survive while the meaning around it fades into darkness. That is not only a loss, it is also a lesson in humility. When we look back into deep history, we are not looking at a simple puzzle made for us to solve. We are looking at real lives that were complete to the people who lived them, even if they are incomplete to us. The most honest response is not to force the stones into certainty, but to let them widen the question. Who were humans before cities taught us how to describe ourselves? What could people do before writing held their names? How much of civilization began not in command, wealth, or power, but in shared labour around a place that mattered? The buried hill gives no final answer. It offers stone, silence, and the outline of a world changing slowly beneath the sky. Perhaps that is why it stays in the mind. It shows us that the beginning of human history was not only about survival, and not only about belief, and not only about tools. It was about fragile bodies learning to gather around something larger than themselves, then leaving that something behind for time to cover and uncover again. And if a community so close to the old human beginning could raise stones, carve animals, shape a hill, and then let the earth close over it, what else did early humans understand that time has not allowed us to hear?